I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Also, thank you for your support. I particularly would like to thank the Keelan Family Foundation for supporting this lecture with a sponsorship. So Don and Veryl Keelan have been very generous to us with specific programming. So thank you, Don, for your support. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Today's presenter is Derek Boothby, and we're always happy to have him with us. Derek has been involved in international politics and security matters for over 40 years, both working for the United Nations and elsewhere. In the UN, he worked on arms control and arms limitations and was director of the Europe Division in the Department of Political Affairs. He was the deputy director for operations in UN weapons inspection and destruction in Iraq, led a chemical weapons investigation in Azerbaijan and Armenia, was second in command of a UN military and civilian operations in the Balkans, and later chairman of the UN Iraq Operational Group. He has given several talks for GMALL over the years, and together with Peter Radford, has been a lively contributor to our GMALL debates. We're very happy to have you with us again, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming in. Now, a little precautionary word. I'm going to explore with the slides, and if I get lost, just bear with me a little bit while I get going. So, the special relationship. The special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States goes back a long, long way, long before Winston Churchill memorably stressed its importance during World War II, and we'll come to that. But in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to try to give you a historical review of how it has been in the past, how it got going, how it is now, and perhaps where it is going to go in the future. And overall, I shall suggest that there's often been, and continues to be, much more to it than is generally realized these days. Realized fairly clearly during World War II, but these days there are other things that are on people's minds. But before getting into the story, it's worth asking, what does it mean to be special? It obviously is more than just being friendly. It implies something unique, a relationship in which there is often common interest, and yet one that can survive the bumps and rough patches that occur. It implies a readiness to act jointly, and yet even being willing on occasion to act contrary to national self-interest. And it also implies that the relationship is long established, has common roots, and a high sense of mutual understanding. So it's through prisms like this that I'm going to talk about the special relationship. And like most special relationships, it's had its ups and downs, its successes and its stresses and strains, and yet it has continued and thrived. It has existed in one form or another since before the foundation of the United States, but as Shakespeare told us in Midsummer Night's Dream, for aught I could ever read, could ever hear by tale or history, the course of true love did never run smooth. We're going to start, perhaps as good as any, with the Virginia Charter of 1606. While settlements at Boston were founded by colonists seeking religious freedom, many of the early settlers in British North America were funded by merchant adventurers. Business connections created by various trading and settlement companies, such as the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London, the Virginia Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company. And being investors and traders, they had legally set themselves up as companies, and so we're going to talk about lawyers. They had lawyers deeply involved. And the role of lawyers in the Middle Temple in London and their practice of common law was significant in the creation of the legal architecture of the English settlements. Sir John Popham, who was the Chief Justice of the Queen's Bench from 1592 to 1607, and Sir Edward Coke, pronounced Cook, not Coke, Cook, Attorney General to Queen Elizabeth and King James I from 1594 to 1606, and then Chief Justice till 1613, both had a hand in drafting the Virginia Charter of 1606. and drawing on Magna Carta to establish that the rights of those born in the colonies had the same freedoms and rights as if they'd been born in England. The 1609 Virginia Charter listed 659 persons and 56 corporate entities as subscribers, and the legal writings of Sir Edward Coke later became the sources of law for George Mason and Thomas Jefferson, and these and the provisions of the English Bill of Rights in 1689 subsequently led to the contributions of Madison and Hamilton to the Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of 1791. Thus, there are ties of language, individual rights, common law and commercial practice, all rooted in what became the unique relationship with Great Britain. Now, not many special relationships of mutual benefit survive a divorce, but this one did. London wanted the colonists to bear some of the costs of the troops that were providing security, and to that end imposed taxes. And then, as you will all know, the colonists objected to the imposition of taxes from a far distant government in London in which they had no representation. And so there were protests like this one. And then later, the Declaration of Independence, and followed 8 years later by the British surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781. And those early years after the Declaration of Independence were rocky, to say the least, and they were not helped in the War of 1812 by the British burning down the White House in 1814. In the following decades, spats continued. The United States objected to the Royal Navy intercepting American merchant ships and press-ganging American sailors into service on board British warships. In 1838-39 came the Pork and Beans War, more properly called the Aroostook War, and the confrontation between the United States and the United Kingdom over the international boundary between the British colony of New Brunswick and the United States state of Maine. It was actually no more than a squabble, and no one was killed, and it was settled by peaceful compromise by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. And then on the other side of the continent, there was the Oregon boundary dispute of 1844-46. So these spats continued. Throughout all those years, British public opinion, or at least those in Britain who thought about it at all, and many Americans recognized that there was a definite relationship between the two peoples. Due to original settlement and subsequent developments in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a shared language, common understanding of values such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, similar liberal democratic principles and parliamentary practices, the same foundations of common law and extensive commercial trade. And the British-American culture also provided on both sides of the Atlantic fertile ground for the development of liberal capitalism and flexible financial markets that provided prosperity and peace and a reserve for war, and those exist to this day. Notwithstanding these parallels, however, differences of interest continue to get in the way. Fathers and sons, and mothers and daughters don't always see eye to eye, and so it was in 1861 at the outbreak of the Civil War. There were those in influential commercial circles in Britain with deep interests in cotton and tobacco, and they supported the Confederacy in its early years. And then there was also the Trent Affair. In 1861, when a US warship intercepted a British mail steamer and removed 2 Confederate diplomats who were on board en route to England and France to raise military and political support. The British demanded the release of the prisoners and also an apology, and at the same time put 8,000 troops into Canada with a latent threat that they might go to war with USA. After some weeks, the Lincoln administration, which of course in 1861 and 62 didn't want to get into a fight with the British and it had more important things to attend to, backed down and they released the 2 prisoners, but without a formal apology. In the latter years of the 19th century, the British Empire was at the zenith of its power. And yet at the same time, it was becoming clear that the United States, its industry and its economy were developing apace, as was its military and political clout. All the more reason why the two should find ways of working together when it suited them, and there was common interest. An interest often converged, and by 1898 relations had warmed to the extent that in the Spanish-American War, Britain remained neutral but openly sided with America. And when Commodore Dewey's fleet sailed out of Hong Kong harbour for Manila, the British sailors and soldiers who were in the harbour unabashedly cheered for them. So by the late 1890s, the revolution of 1776 was now 120 years in the rear mirror, and the public Anglophobia that had existed among a number of Americans had declined. It had become clear that both countries had things in common, and along came the grand rapprochement. Several significant changes made the great rapprochement mutually beneficial. Great Britain came to value the United States as a democratic ally at a time when the balance of power in Europe was seeing the rise of autocracies in Russia and Germany. And changes in the United States also made an improved relationship possible. The United States had emerged from the Civil War as a single industrial nation. And after the Spanish-American War, the United States was also now a new imperial power, with new possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So during the Boxer Uprising in China, which is 1898 to 1901, the United States and the UK were both members of the Eight-Nation Alliance, which eventually defeated the Boxers and the Imperial Chinese Army. Meanwhile, American and British cartoonists had a fine time. In this one, you'll note that the guns on the left are larger, but on the horizon on the right, there's a growing naval fleet. And you'll also notice that the older lady on the left is wearing glasses as she shakes hands with the younger lady on the right, who is kind of considering just what does all this mean. Essentially, in a world of rising and declining powers, the two nations put aside the troubles of their history and instead came to appreciate their common goals and interests. Bismarck had once prophetically said that the most significant fact of the 20th century would be, quote, the fact that the North Americans speak English, unquote, and how true that turned out to be. So by the first decade of the 20th century, the industrial engine and economy of the United States was outpacing that of the United Kingdom. In 1875, Britain had accounted for 47% of world production of pig iron and almost 40% of steel. 2 decades later, however, British share of world production had dropped to 29% for pig iron and 22.5% for steel. And by 1900, the United States was the world's largest producer of steel and also the lowest cost producer. And at the same time, Germany was catching up with Britain. The United States population by this time was now twice that of the United Kingdom, although taking into account Britain's imperial possessions, the population of the British Empire was well over 5 times that of the United States. But the writing on the wall was very clear. Big cousin, little cousin on the left little cousin on the right was becoming big cousin. And in 1910, Britain was deeply engaged in a battleship building competition with Germany. And 4 years later, of course, Europe stumbled into World War I. Widely expected to last only a few weeks, or at least a few months, it gradually became a debilitating slog of trench warfare on land and the new weapons of war in the air and at sea. Immense losses of blood and treasure for Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. And by the end of 1916, the participants were locked in a standoff with neither side able to deliver a winning blow. Until then, the United States had carefully avoided becoming entangled in any of Europe's war. But early in 1917, this balance was tipped by the revelation by British intelligence of the Zimmermann telegram, by which Germany invited Mexico to enter into war against the United States, in return for which lost territories in the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas would be returned to Mexican sovereignty. And separately, in early 1917 as well, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Not every American agreed that the United States should become engaged in the war. Some regarded the Zimmermann telegram as no more than British trickery. But President Wilson, in his message to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, proclaimed, quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy," unquote. And in so doing, America openly declared its acceptance of a major role in the world leadership. The doughboys lined up to volunteer, and the United States went off to war. It was the arrival on the Western Front of American men, muscle, and war material that led to the end of the war 18 months later. And together with the flow of ample supplies across the Atlantic, American involvement saved Great Britain and consolidated the relationship even further. But when in 1919 the time came to negotiate a peace treaty, once again the British and the Americans did not see eye to eye in all things. The British, led by Prime Minister Lord George, were keen to preserve their maritime superiority and, of course, strong links with empire and the colonies, whereas President Wilson had lofty ideals for world peace and the self-determination of the liberty of peoples, particularly in the colonies. Wilson's famous 14 principles included resolution of colonial claims and the settlement of a number of territorial issues on the basis of self-determination. And in the middle, hard-bitten French Prime Minister Clemenceau snorted with derision, while Lord Lloyd George, who was caught in between the French and the Americans, he was caught in between as well, between British imperial responsibilities, and on the other hand, he didn't wish to dislocate British interests and appreciation for a relationship with America. And so he did what most politicians do in such circumstances. He equivocated and kicked the can down the road. And another issue that at times has bedeviled Anglo-American relations has been Ireland. It has been estimated, this one is for Don Keelan, I hope you enjoy this one, Don. It has been estimated that perhaps 10% of the American population can, in one way or another, claim some Irish heritage. Incidentally, the English-Welsh claiming ancestry is something like 7 or 8%. The Scots is 1.7%. So even if you put England, Wales and Scotland together, it's still not as much ancestry as the Irish claim. Oliver Cromwell's harsh treatment of the Irish in the 1650s and the subsequent shipment of some 8,000 Irish prisoners of war to the Chesapeake colonies led to what became a long-standing sore between Irish immigrants to the United States and successive governments in London. And these troubles came to a head with the Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, and then the secession of most of the island in 1922, which then became the Republic of Ireland. More recently, of course, there was the civil conflict and unrest of Northern Ireland in the late 20th century, and the famous Good Friday Agreement that brought that conflict to an end in 1998 could not have been achieved without the American constructive help and guidance of President Clinton and Senator George Mitchell. The 1920s and 1930s saw practical links between the United States and the United Kingdom develop further. In banking, insurance, investment, and other aspects of commerce, the technological advances in communications and transport made day-to-day interaction much easier. In entertainment, the advent of movies and radio created stars who moved easily across the Atlantic with the benefits of the common language and a deep understanding of each other's culture. In literature, arts, and the theatre, the exchanges prospered. In science and medicine, experts and expertise often became interchangeable. Similarities were applauded, and at the same time, national differences of character and personality were for the most part treated with shrugs and good humour. And since the days of the early colonial settlements, there have been close links, of course, between American and British financial markets central banks, and monetary and fiscal policies. And in his book, The Political Economy of the Special Relationship, author Jeremy Green has described how their, quote, transatlantic integration and competition spurred the rise of the financial sector, an increased reliance on debt, a global easing of regulation, and the ascendance of monetarism and the transition to neoliberalism. And according to the US Chamber of Commerce, the UK is the largest single investor in the United States, and British companies have invested more than $560 billion here. And here are some statistics of the considerable trade and investment ties between the two countries. So I'm sure most of you have heard of a company called BAE Systems, which is a British multinational defense, security and aerospace company, and it has an American subsidiary, which is one of the 6 largest suppliers to the United States Department of Defense. American firms have invested over $750 billion in the British market, and the UK is the 2nd largest recipient of US investment worldwide. Overall, in 2018, the United States enjoyed a net surplus of $21.8 billion of trade and goods and services with the United Kingdom. Significant aspects of the special relationship have been military and political in nature. Now, as this has been my professional background, I'm going to ask you to allow me to focus on those dimensions because they too have had their ups and downs. It has been in the circumstances of war and threats to security that the relationship can be seen to be most vital, and yet at times deeply problematic. In 1940, President Roosevelt threw the resources of the United States behind the British. He ordered the resupply of British divisions that had had to leave their equipment behind at the evacuation of Dunkirk. And in September 1940, he agreed to release 50 outdated destroyers. But this wasn't a free gift. He exchanged the destroyers for 99-year leases on 8 British naval and air facilities in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. Looking back, there's a tendency to believe that the United States entry into World War II was inevitable. But while there was support for the Lend-Lease Act adopted in March 1941, supplies to the Allies on credit, again not for free, into isolationism was still very strong. And back to the business of ancestry, some 15% of the present American population claims ancestry from Germany. So it's understandable that President Roosevelt had some caution as to how he should go about supporting the UK. There were many powerful voices against the United States going into war in support of Great Britain. Even so, Roosevelt pushed on as far as he could in aiding British and Allied ships in US convoys to Iceland. And in December 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden, isolationism died overnight. In the meantime, as the European situation worsened for the British, Prime Minister Churchill, in his underground war rooms close to 10 Downing Street, was often on the transatlantic telephone to Roosevelt, asking for more help and urging him to be forthcoming with weapons, ships, aircraft, and supplies for the beleaguered island. And in London, Ambassador Kennedy, who had been unfailingly negative about Britain's ability to survive, he had been replaced. And those of you who have read the book Citizens of London will recall of how the alliance between the United States and the United Kingdom was strengthened by 3 key American players at a critical time. Edward R. Murrow, the head of CBS News in Europe, Averell Harriman, the millionaire who ran Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program, and John Gilbert Winant, the idealistic US ambassador and successor to Ambassador Kennedy. And their reports back to the United States and their work in smoothing the way for the provision of American support were crucial contributions to the war effort. The United States Lend-Lease Act was vital for Britain's survival, but Americans didn't make it cheap. By the end of World War II, Britain had amassed an immense debt of £21 billion, which was a lot of money in those days, far beyond its ability to pay. And in fact, it was only 14 years ago, at the end of 2006, that the United Kingdom made its final payment of about $83 million and discharged that particular debt. During World War II, in New Mexico, scientists from the United Kingdom worked with those of the United States on the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. And on the battlefields of Europe and at sea and in the air, military cooperation and coordination were developed, and the leading senior officers of the United States and the United Kingdom worked closely together. And yet, again, not always without irritation and friction. Stories abound of the sometimes prickly relations between touchy, opinionated British Field Marshal Montgomery and others, and cautious, careful General Eisenhower and pugnacious General Patton. And as the war drew to its end in April and May 1945, with the Soviet army pushing hard to occupy Berlin, Churchill was urging General Eisenhower to continue to advance to Berlin. General Patton agreed with him. But US General Omar Bradley warned that it might cost as many as 100,000 casualties, and cautious Eisenhower accepted his view. Eisenhower ordered all US and UK armies to halt when they reached the Elbe River. The special relationship therefore went only so far when critical military decisions had to be made. During the war, it was the meeting of minds between Roosevelt and Churchill that solidified the basic precepts of a rules-based liberal order. They agreed the Atlantic Charter in August 1941 by meeting on board ships off the coast of Newfoundland. And in 1945, the Atlantic Charter then led to the creation of the United Nations. After the war, massive United States assistance was made available not only to Britain, but to shattered Europe in the form of the Marshall Plan. And in this, Churchill and President Truman were of the same mind. As Churchill repeated on the frontispiece of his book, History of the Second World War, he said, quote, "In war, resolution. In defeat, defiance. In victory, magnanimity. And in peace, goodwill." And yet, even then, again, there were marked differences of opinion. President Roosevelt and his successor, President Truman, strongly supported independence for India and the colonies of Britain and other European powers, while in 1942, Churchill had robustly stated, quote, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." But in the end, of course, that is precisely what did happen. In June 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, and the Korean War began. The United Nations Security Council authorized an international military operation led by the United States. The UK was still adjusting to its reduced global importance, and yet at the same time it was a member of the UN Security Council and still deeply indebted to the United States from World War II. The British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, on being reminded by a colleague that Korea was far away and not exactly a priority interest for Britain, said, "Distant, yes, but nonetheless an obligation." And these days it has been almost forgotten that there are some 100,000 British troops fighting in the Korean War. In the decade from 1946 to 1955, the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom continued to flourish, with of course the latter being in the subordinate position. Churchill continued to wring what he could from it. In 1952, Churchill was inducted into the Society of the Cincinnati on the grounds that he was, quote, qualified for membership thanks to his great-great-grandfather, Lieutenant Reuben Murray of Connecticut, who had marched with General Washington, unquote. And President Eisenhower, in a 1965 article entitled "The Churchill I Knew," quoted Churchill as once saying that although his father was British, my mother, quote, "my mother was American and my ancestors were in Washington's army. I am myself an English-speaking Union." But again, not all was sweetness and light. In 1956, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal and thereby took its operation from the British-run Suez Canal Company. Britain and France decided to take strong action, and they secretly developed a plan for Israel to invade Egyptian facilities in the Sinai Desert, whereupon Britain and France would then deploy an interpositional force to protect the operation of the Suez Canal. And this military operation, it was believed in London and Paris, would result in the downfall of Nasser. Well, that was all very well, but in Washington, the United States was playing an entirely different game. With the larger aim of promoting stability in the Middle East and keeping the Soviet nose out of the region, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles were trying to foster Nasser as the natural leader of the Middle East. Eisenhower posed the question for American policy, quote, "How could we possibly support Britain and France if in so doing we lose the whole Arab world?" Unquote. And so to a shocked Prime Minister Anthony Eden in London, Eisenhower made it very clear that there would be neither political nor military support forthcoming from the United States. When the Anglo-French military attack took place in October 1956, Nasser sank ships in the Suez Canal, thereby blocking tankers en route to Europe from the Persian Gulf. And he also sabotaged a pipeline in Syria. And so with the entire oil supply to Britain cut off, London turned to Washington for North American oil. But Eisenhower refused, reportedly saying to his aides, quote, "Those who began this operation should be left to work out their own oil problems, to boil in their own oil, so to speak," unquote. And the value of the British pound plummeted, a run on sterling reserves followed, and to regain any American support at all, the British had to accept an immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Egypt. So much for the special relationship on that occasion. And notwithstanding this serious embarrassment, in other issues, cooperation continued. British and American intelligence services, known as the Cousins, had continued to work closely together since World War II, and the two countries were generally in close concert within the United Nations Security Council. And in the light of increased tensions with the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s, the UK extended basing facilities to the United States for B-29s, and later naval facilities at Holy Loch in Scotland for the basing of US ballistic missile submarines. And when the last US Navy ship sailed out from the Holy Loch in 1992, there had then been 31 years of constant American naval presence in southwest Scotland. And all this brings us to Reagan and Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister from the 1979 to 1990. Along the way, she'd acquired several nicknames: the Iron Lady, the Milk Snatcher, Attila the Hen, and her years in office coincided with those of President Reagan from 1981 to 89. Overtly, they got on famously well, and yet below the surface there were often serious differences. They clashed over issues such as Grenada, a British dependency in the Caribbean, which the United States invaded in 1983 without giving any advance notice whatsoever to the UK. Margaret Thatcher was very annoyed. They clashed over sanctions against the Soviet Union and the Strategic Defence Initiative and nuclear arms control and missile policy. And they clashed over the Middle East, especially over Lebanon and Libya. And yet, all the while, for the benefit of the media, they crafted an image of conservative unity. In April 1982, Argentinian troops invaded the Falkland Islands and the South Atlantic. True to style, Margaret Thatcher was having none of it, and she launched a major offensive to recover the islands. But the islands were over 8,000 miles away from the UK, and Britain's military capabilities and supplies were no longer what they'd been decades earlier. Washington, however, had no intention of getting involved, but there was coordination of assistance and supplies between the United States and the UK. The United States repositioned a spy satellite from its Soviet-watching orbit in the Northern Hemisphere to a place over the South Atlantic where it could provide it could provide intelligence to the Royal Navy. And the United States also supplied millions of gallons of aviation fuel, hundreds of Sidewinder missiles, aircraft matting, thousands of rounds of mortar shells, and other supplies. And it was reported that Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger played a bold role, as both he and the Pentagon feared that if Britain sailed into a military disaster, that would be a severe setback to the deterrent quality of the entire North Atlantic Alliance. So again, the assistance that was given to the UK was the product of the special relationship, but at the same time, it was with the wider interests of the United States in mind. By the year 2000, Tony Blair was Prime Minister in London. Further troubles were brewing over Iraq, and shadows lengthened with the Al-Qaeda attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in September 2001. By 2002, war drums were sounding once more in Washington, and the United States was asking, well, what did the United Kingdom intend to do? It was scarcely an idle question, because for diplomatic and public relations reasons, the United States needed to avoid being perceived as being taking action totally by itself. But in late 2002 and early 2003, Tony Blair was in a political fix. British intelligence was indicating that there were insufficient reasons to justify another invasion, and yet here he was being impressed by the United States to join in. To Washington, what was the special relationship about if your major ally couldn't be counted on when needed? So it was a murky time in London, and Blair has since been sharply criticised for taking the wrong decision. After the conflict ended, it was later established to American satisfaction that Iraq had no nuclear or biological weapons, and all Saddam Hussein had were battlefield chemical weapons, which in the event were not used. However, in early 2003, the United States was determined to achieve regime change in Iraq, and in the circumstances at the time of his decision, if the special relationship meant anything at all, in my view, I think Tony Blair had very little choice. In the end, when the coalition invaded Iraq in March 2003, there were 45,000 British troops taking part. So then, how does the special relationship stand in 2021? As I've described, since 1917, it has not been an equally balanced two-way street. Indeed, former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt once said that the relationship was so special that in fact only one side knew about it at all. But I would suggest that his was a narrow view and blind to the wide variety of dimensions. Both countries have their own arrangements and other countries with other countries, but in the principles and practice of liberal democracy, in trade and commerce, in finance and business, in arts, culture and entertainment, in military planning, training and operations, and in intelligence and information sharing, the overall level of cooperation between the UK and the US is unique amongst major powers. The advantages that have come from their dynamic and cutting-edge economies have done remarkably well in global markets. The market economy and system of liberal capitalism work in both countries have contributed significantly to innovation, mutual investment, competition, and generally rising living standards. And added to these benefits, there have been others behind the scenes which are not so widely known about. Let me give you some examples. For all its dominance in world affairs, the United States still does need allies, and particularly those with assets that can be made available to further United States interests. There continues to be valuable intelligence sharing among the group known as the Five Eyes, that is USA, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And within that group, there is an even closer relationship on appropriate matters between the United States NSA and the United Kingdom GCHQ. And the Royal Navy has recently built and commissioned two brand new aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. They have been built specifically to carry American F-35B vertical and short takeoff aircraft purchased from the United States. And the F-35B is developed from the principles of the US AV-8B Harrier marine aircraft, which itself was an improved version of the British Harrier jet. The two carriers have been deliberately designed to be not just interoperable with the US Navy, but capable of full integration with US Navy operations. And in September 2020, the US Marine Corps Fighter Attack Squadron with 10 F-35B aircraft embarked on HMS Queen Elizabeth, and they've been there ever since. The agreement was in January, just last month, an agreement was signed between the United States and the UK defense officials for the establishment of a joint carrier group. That joint US-UK carrier group will be deployed in the Western Pacific in the next few months. And as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom has said, quote, "This is special relationship in action. Our forces train, fight, and win side by side to protect the two countries." Separately, the United States Air Force has an important airbase in the UK at RAF Lakenheath. And at Fylingdales in Yorkshire, there's a ballistic missile warning radar installation, which is part of the US-UK early warning system and the United States Space Surveillance System. And we also have an American golf course that you may have heard about. Among the defense and security arrangements in the Indian Ocean since 1966, the British Ocean Territory of Diego Garcia has been the home of a large American base with some 5,000 service personnel and contractors for storage of military supplies and equipment, and a 2-mile-long runway for US Air Force operations. On British Ascension Island, in the middle of the Atlantic, there's a joint Royal Air Force, United States Air Force airbase with some 800 United States personnel monitoring radar and telemetry tracking sites for rocket launches, space debris, and other functions. So our politics may be different, but in general, our social, cultural, and humanitarian approaches and our attitudes to human rights are very similar. And this is because the roots go way back, and they're common throughout the English-speaking world. By virtue of our common language, plays and musicals on the stages of one country often transfer across the Atlantic with ease. I've seen The Book of Mormon in Leicester Square, London, and Andrew Lloyd Webber's musicals have been great successes on Broadway. Noel Coward and the Beatles were as successful in the United States as Irving Berlin and the Grateful Dead were in the United Kingdom. So then, there is no doubt that there have been, and there continue to be, unique relations between our two countries. It does not mean that the two are both totally in step, and nor should we expect them to be. And as we look ahead, perhaps a sharp caution is needed. A well-established adage to bear in mind is that countries don't have friends, they have interests. And in some respects, with Britain a member of the EU, for the United States, the United Kingdom was a window and a gate into Europe. But now with Brexit, that will no longer be the case. The United Kingdom has chosen to cast itself adrift from the EU and float somewhere in the North Atlantic, neither American fish nor European Union fowl. And it cannot be overlooked that President Biden has Irish roots and has already made it clear to London that Brexit must not undermine the Good Friday Agreement. Moreover, Boris Johnson may look and at times almost act like a mini Trump, but in trade negotiations with the United States, the UK will need the United States more than the other way around. And Washington knows that very well and will, as they have in the past, drive a hard bargain. After all, business is business. Under President Trump, Washington has indicated that it will want open access to Britain for America's chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef, and it will also want a role for the US farmer in Britain's national service. But the EU, on the other hand, has made it abundantly clear that if Britain wants a trade deal on food and other items with the EU, then it will have to continue to comply with EU standards, which are not chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef. While President Biden has made it clear that the United States regards NATO as the cornerstone of transatlantic security, which he did at the Munich Security Conference just last week, in the coming decades, the United States foreign policy attention will increasingly look westwards to the Pacific Rim, rather than eastwards to Europe. And furthermore, looking further ahead still, it has been estimated by the 2045 the United States will be a white minority country, and therefore significantly less given to having regard for historical connections with Europe and the United Kingdom. And indeed, as time passes, there is no reason at all why many younger Americans, particularly Latino, Asian, and other non-white Americans, should feel any particular affinity with the British. So as we look ahead then, how do matters stand? For the reasons that I have described, the specialness of the relationship between our two countries has been due to many factors, from having the same language, similar systems of law, the same values and freedoms, common understanding of liberal democracy, human rights, finance, the promotion of liberal capitalism, and close cooperation in peace and war. And I believe it will also continue in matters of defence, intelligence and security when the interests of both countries have common purpose. In the areas of industry, technology, trade and finance, it seems to me that there will continue to be healthy competition. But at the same time, strong links will continue for straightforward commercial interests. We began with lawyers and we're going to end with lawyers. Finally, back to the connections with Magna Carta and the rule of law. This is a photograph of the bronze doors of the United States Supreme Court. The panel at the bottom right there is King John and one of his barons, commemorating Magna Carta of 1215. And the one above it is King Edward, affirming Magna Carta in 1275. And the panel above that is Chief Justice Edward Coke and King James I in their dispute in 1613, when Chief Justice Sir Edward Coke reminded the king that no man is above the law. This is a photograph of the Magna Carta Memorial at Runnymede, where the first Magna Carta was sealed by King John in 1215. The memorial was created not by the British lawyers, but by the American Bar Association in 1957. And its pillar in the centre is inscribed, quote, "To commemorate Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under law," unquote. And here is what Sir Winston Churchill said in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946. "We must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great values of freedom and the rights of man, which are the inheritance of the English-speaking world, and which through Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, the habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the English common law find their most famous expression in the American Declaration of Independence." So the common denominators of it all are common language, respect for the rule of law and our mutual values, and the history that lies behind them will remain unchanged. For these reasons, if no other, and despite the occasional flashes of irritation, there will continue to be a warm mutual regard, a mutual agreement on many democratic and social values, and of course, a mutual gentle ribbing at each other's peculiarities and eccentricities. And in all these respects, I believe that the special relationship will continue, and long may it be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And we do have a few questions already there. So first, from Steve Sinding, with Britain an ever-fading power and the U.S. ever more multicultural, is maintenance of a special relationship possible or even relevant?
Well, I think I tried to answer that in the end. And I agree with, as more and more young Americans come from Latino and non-white, Asian, why should the connections with Britain be continued? But for all those reasons that I've said, the common language and the common law and the huge connections in finance. Finance and business, there are massive connections between the two countries, which don't exist to the same extent between the United States and France, Germany, or elsewhere. So I think history is what history is, and that special relationship, it will change. It won't be necessarily as strong as it has been in the past, but I personally think it will continue. Others, however, might have other comments, and I'm open to those.
The next question is, after Brexit, how should the US work with the UK and the EU on common challenges such as China?
Well, although some will disagree, I'm afraid I think that 4 years of Trump has done a lot of damage to the American image in Europe. Not only the UK, but other Europeans are having to hedge their bets. And they will hedge their bets by trying to keep things at reasonable level with Russia. But there's not much to be gained economically from Russia, where there's a lot to be gained economically from China. And so, in fact, I think there's a tendency in Europe to basically look to China for more trade. And when the United States comes across and sort of says, we don't like you taking your pipelines of gas from Russia, and we don't like you taking Huawei, the Chinese computer company, Europe is going to sort of say, well, so what? We're not necessarily going to fall into line. So I think it's going to be really rather difficult, and it's going to be interesting to see what attitude the Biden administration takes on these kinds of issues. As I mentioned before, under the Trump administration, in driving a hard bargain with the UK on a trade, there was this wish that the UK would accept chlorinated chicken and other things from the interests of the pharmaceutical industry in the national health, and I don't think the UK is going to be particularly likely to agree to either of those things, because the UK, when all said and done, yes, is out of the EU, but it's still part of Europe, and therefore it still has to have its trade arrangements with the EU. So I think there's going to be some difficult troubles ahead over trade, and there are going to be some things where the US and the UK will agree, and there'll be other things where the US and the UK don't agree. It remains to be seen.
Next question is from Jed. Is the UK headed toward a minority majority population?
Well, the UK, of course, has its problems over the possible independence of Scotland. And also you see, in the Brexit vote, England and Wales voted in favour of Brexit, but Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against Brexit and wanted to remain in the EU. And of course, now that the UK has left the EU, that has tended to strengthen the public wish in Scotland move towards independence. Now, how Boris Johnson is going to play that remains to be seen. Rather like Catalina in Spain, if you remember, had a referendum of its own. And the Spanish government in Madrid sort of said, you're not entitled to have a referendum of your own. It has to be approved by the central government. And the same attitude will take place in the UK. London will say to Scotland, you're not entitled to have a referendum of your own. If you choose to have a referendum of your own and you secede, don't expect the British Bank of England to support the Scottish pound. And if you do succeed and you leave, you want to be independent, don't expect to be the first in the line to rejoin the EU. There are other countries that are ahead of you, so it's going to be difficult. The population in the UK, the total population is about 60 to 65 million. There are 5 million Scots, 3 million Welsh, 1.5 million in Northern Ireland, and the remaining 50 odd million are in England. So I think it will be a great sadness if, in fact, the union breaks up, but it could well do. We'll have to see what happens, because passions certainly in Scotland and in Northern Ireland are really very strong, and London has got to pay some attention and recognise those passions. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but those are the issues. From the point of view of the diversity, I think something like 4%, right? 4% of the British population are Muslim. So it's not a high percentage, but they do tend to live together in ghettos, and that creates social and economic problems of its own.
Okay. Let's see. I believe this is Elliot says he thinks now that China has replaced the U.S. as Europe's #1 trading partner.
Yes, I think it has. I read that the other day as well. and those of you who actually listened to or watched my talk on China, when I talked at China's Belt and Road Initiative, China has been very vigorous in trying to promote better contacts with and trade with Europe, and sees a Euro-Asian trading arrangement to mutual advantage between China and Europe. And this is one of the major issues that the European Union is trying to come to grips with. On the one hand, it sees the benefit of China's a huge market for the export of German machinery and European goods. And yet at the same time, the more that the EU moves towards arrangements with China, the more it's likely to irritate Washington. And so I think there's a difficult balancing act taking place and going to take place in the next several years as to what's going to happen.
This question is from John Delano. Could you comment on the interests and wisdom of challenging the Chinese in the South China Sea? Are the interests of the US and the UK worth the risk of war?
No, I personally, and I've said this before, and some of you will know, I personally think that the military of the United States and of course UK and the military of China do not intend and do not want to find themselves in conflict. However, there's always the chance of there being the unforeseen accident or irritation which happens. So, for instance, when the UK-US Carrier Strike Group deploys in the Western Pacific in the spring, if in fact they get too far into the South China Sea on the argument of the navigation of international waters, then China will probably be faced with the political issue of, well, do they react or not? If they don't react, they're perceived as being weak, but if they react, how are they going to react? And so there's always a risk that something should happen. I personally believe, and I know this is not necessarily a widespread view here in USA, that China basically wants to sort of say, look, you you Westerners, you Americans can't have the whole of the Pacific. Frankly, west of Hawaii is our area. You can have Hawaii into the east of Hawaii. And if in fact you put yourself in Chinese shoes after the Boxer Rebellion and the various other occasions in the past when China has been humiliated by the British, the Americans, the Japanese, China is now no longer going to be humiliated and will want to actually flex its muscles and feel its oats. To that extent, therefore, I think there's always a chance of there being an untoward incident. If an American overflight flies over what the Chinese recognize as their airspace, and somebody somewhere on one of those Paracel or Spratly Island bases happens to fire a missile, not necessarily told to from Beijing, but if they do, and then the aircraft is then shot down or is injured in some way, then in fact things will spiral very, very quickly. And I'm sure that the military on both sides are taking very great steps to try to make sure that that doesn't happen. But as we all know, it happened in World War I, it happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. These things can suddenly happen and get out of control. So I think for all those reasons, great care is going to have to be taken as to what happens. On the other hand, for the UK, as I mentioned, these two aircraft carriers have been deliberately designed not just to operate with American planes. When I was in the Royal Navy, one of my early ships was HMS Ark Royal in the Mediterranean, and we cross-operated with a US aircraft carrier, and we had our Seahawk fighter jets landing on board the US aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier's F-8U Crusaders landing on board us. That's cross-operating. That's not interoperable. Interoperable, now you have these US Marine vertical takeoff and lift aircraft on board HMS Queen Elizabeth, and they are going to operate with each other. And I think that's a great sign. And for the US to put for the United Kingdom to go to the expense, and it is expense, of that carrier strike group being deployed in the West Pacific is, I think, very much a demonstration that the UK wants this special relationship in military and intelligence with the United States to continue.
On the issue of China still, and go back to another one. But Steve Sinding says, Derek, I admire your commitment to the relationship and your optimism about its survivability, but I fear that Britain's decision to leave the EU will make it increasingly irrelevant in world politics. All the commonalities you cite will be there, of course, but the US will have to look elsewhere for alliances that will help it compete militarily and economically with emerging powers of China and India.
Steve, I actually agree with that. I personally think it was a great mistake for the UK to leave the EU. I look at it from a military political point of view, from a security point of view. I don't look at it at Brexit as many people did from an economic and let's get away from mother's apron strings in Brussels point of view. But I think that the UK, having decided to leave the EU, does indeed have the implications, Steve, that you mentioned, namely it's of less value, as I said in my talk, it's of less value as a gate and a window into the EU to the United States. And of course, at the same time, it kind of undermines the EU's clout when in fact one of the three main countries in the EU, UK, France, and Germany, the UK leaves. Therefore, it reduces the UK itself. So I think as the US looks further west into the Indo-Pacific arena, then yes, for very many years, the Atlantic used to be regarded, it seems to me, by the United States as the front door, and the back door was the Pacific. And then during Obama's time and since, that has reversed. The United States now looks westwards, understandably, to China, and that's the front door. And the back door is Europe. And as long as European security doesn't get out of control, the United States will focus much more of its political, military, intelligence, and economic clout looking westwards. That, incidentally, on the other hand, is where the Diego Garcia will come in handy. For the United States to have closer relations and with countries in the Indo-Pacific area, that base that the United States have is in Diego Garcia is extremely valuable. There are political problems that the UK has in keeping that. It's under political pressure at the United Nations to restore that to the original islanders, which the UK evicted in order to establish that as a base. And so there are political problems ahead for the UK. But I think the UK will hang on to it because it is so valuable to offer that as a base for the United States in the Indo-Pacific arena.
Okay. This question is from Bruce McLaury. Isn't London's centrality in global finance going to fade vis-a-vis, say, Amsterdam, and hence the close links between US and London in finance going to fade?
Bruce, yeah, I know there are those. I know there are some companies. When the UK voted in favour of Brexit, all the financial people in the financial centre of London voted to stay as part of Europe, and they saw that there would be threats to the position of the London as a financial centre. And indeed, what has happened is that there have been several thousand jobs which have been moved out of London to Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam. But Michael Jeffrey, some of you know, who is a British friend, I don't think he's actually following this particular talk. He was an international banker, and he says that the thing is that the nimbleness and the agility of the financial centre in London is such that it will be much quicker at being able to respond and react to the loss of some jobs. So if 10% or so of the jobs leave London, that will still leave London as 90%. And because they will be able to rise to the new situation much more nimbly and agile than Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam can do. He believes that the feeling that London will lose considerably its position as a world financial centre, he believes that that is unfounded. Now, I'm not a banker and I'm not an economist, but that's what Michael says. Bruce, I mean, I know that you come from a banking feeling and you probably disagree with that, but that's what Michael Jeffrey says.
This is from John Delano. Doesn't the strong assent of China underscore the importance of cultivating global alliances instead of the previous administration's America alone? Wouldn't it make sense for the US, UK, EU to strengthen alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand? The power and influence of such a large set of alliances are large compared to the foreseeable network of Chinese alliances. What are your perspectives on this perspective?
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. There are some of us. There's an article the other day which Steve and one or two others taking part in this evening, we both read together, which talked about the fact that in the light of 4 years of Trump, that's why countries, America's friends and allies, now have to hedge their bets. If American voters can elect a person like Trump once, they can elect a person like Trump again. And therefore, there is no reliability that at the end of 4 years of the Biden administration, that there won't be some sort of reincarnation, if not Trump, a Trump-like view. Now, that being the case, the European Union and NATO have an organization that they can hedge their bets with. But Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Vietnam, there is no such organization in the Western Pacific. They have nothing to hedge their bets with. And therefore, if the umbrella of American security umbrella, which is offered traditionally by the United States to Japan and South Korea, if that is questioned or felt to be questioned, then those countries in the Western Pacific will inevitably then start looking at China and say, well, we may not like it, but we're going to have to hold our nose and do something with China. All that means that all the more reason why I think in international security and stability, the United States will continue to look further west. And to the extent that the Europeans sort of say, well, look, the Pacific Rim is a long way away from us. We'll help if we can, but fundamentally have other fish to fry. And I think it's going to be one of the serious political issues, international security issues of the next decade or two. As I say, fortunately, the existence of NATO, one of the things that the Trump antagonism towards Europeans, you're not paying enough, you're not doing your stuff. In fact, already the Europeans have started to spend more on their own defense, which is not a bad thing. It's a silver lining to a Trumpian cloud, in my view. But at the same time, like any modern country, there are huge pressures, social, economic pressures, and lots of people in these countries who say, why spend money on defense? Who is the enemy? Russia's not going to invade us. Russia's a difficult neighbor to live with, but its economy is no bigger than the economy of Italy. So they're not going to invade us, and we're certainly not going to be invaded by China. So why, the voters will say, why spend so much on defense? And so that's going to be part of the problem that the political leaderships in the European countries are going to have to face. I know I'm rambling in a sense. I think there's no clear answer to the kind of question that you pose. It's just one of the big issues that's going to hang out there for a lot of the governments in the course of the next 10 and 20 years. Well, thank you all very much indeed. You've all been very patient, and I hope I haven't trodden on too many toes. And Gloria, thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hope to see you at the next lectures, and have a good night.